So my name's Lachlan Evenson. I'm a team lead on the Cloud Platform Engineering team at Lithium Technologies. You may have seen me up here yesterday. So today and during this session, I wanted to do two things with you. Actually go through our journey with containers on OpenStack at Lithium and give you guys a pattern to where you can start. So when I started out on this journey 2 or 3 months ago, it was really hard to find resources on where to get started, where to look. So today I'm going to go through how we did it and give you guys access to how we did it to kickstart your journey as well. So I wanted to level set as well while I'm on this slide. How many user operators are there in this room? Okay, I wrote this for you guys. For everyone else, bear with me. Lunch is coming. So it's going to get technical, it's going to get deep, and I'm going to go down into the nuts and bolts of how I did this to give you guys an idea of not only what's involved, but actually it's not that complicated. So I want people to start looking at how they can utilize their OpenStack platform to provide container service. I made a couple of assumptions as well. One is that you know about OpenStack and have had some experience running it. The other one is you know what Kubernetes is or know what Kubernetes provides. And the last one is you know what containers are and what they provide. So as long as you're there, you probably follow along. But if not, come and see me afterwards. Happy to talk. OK. So my slide deck didn't get updated. OK, I'll run with it. I'll run with it. So, my slide deck is out of order. So should I just go with this? I'll just go with it. OK, that's fine. So about 3 months ago, we started looking at Kubernetes. We'd been keeping an eye on it for about a year, but we felt 3 months ago it was a good point. It was right before the V1 launch. We could actually get this into shape and get it out to an environment on a road to production. So running container workloads on Kubernetes on OpenStack. Our first iteration was probably, as most of you who've played with Kubernetes, is a Vagrant cluster. So you actually pull down the open source repo and you run a cluster up and bam, you have a Vagrant Kubernetes cluster. You have nodes you can deploy. It's a great place to get your feet wet and get an idea of how Kubernetes works and how you can use it in your environment to deploy containers. So soon after I started playing with that, I was asked to present at the V1 launch for Google at Kubernetes at OSCON, which was about 2 months ago. And there I actually presented some other skunkwork projects where I'd actually started pulling it out of Vagrant. Because Vagrant was great, but I knew to get this thing going, I needed developer support. And I needed to give the developers access to a cluster where they could deploy their containers and see how this held together. So I don't know if you saw that launch, but I actually showed one such skunkworks project that I'd put together. So after OSCON, I came back to the office, and my boss said, you have the green light to run with Kubernetes. We think you've solved all the problems that we had questions to. You've got 1 month to get this out into production and push out a microservice. So at the end of August, we're actually going to have an end-to-end deployment in production running Kubernetes on OpenStack. So I just wanted to illustrate that the level of complexity to getting this out and getting people onboarded is probably not as hard as you think. So the last point there is Q Operation Fury Road. So I'm Australian, and I don't know if you know the heritage of Mad Max, but I knew I was in for trouble of the month of August. I had to deliver Kubernetes in production on OpenStack. But anyway, I had to put my money where my mouth was, so I was up for the challenge. So what I realized is the honeymoon is over. Now I actually have to deliver something to the company and to the engineering team and to revolutionize their experience with containers and using our OpenStack platform. So as I mentioned before, we were running with Vagrant. Now I needed to extend it to multi-node, multi-platform, deal with all the issues you have when you go to prod, HA, redundancy, running apps on multi-nodes. So I knew one thing I wanted to do was actually build the cluster really quickly and early in the month and give the developers access to that. So what I did, and I'll show you soon, is stood something up really quickly and handed it over. And what that actually led to, I'll go into some details. So how do we provide access? I knew that developers wanted to run their workloads up, have them connect to VM provision workloads and bare metal workloads. So it needed to be an experience where they could run their containers and their workloads on Kubernetes and have them connect to environments that we already had running. So that was my baseline prerequisites. So here's what we did. This is where I'm going to get into the trenches a little bit, so bear with me. We had a couple of proof of concepts, so I'm going to go into two such examples. The first one, it was my requirement. So I needed to build a cluster that the developers had access to so that they could actually get up and running and see how Kubernetes provided an orchestration platform for their containers. So I started with Kubernetes running on OpenStack VMs. And I worked with the team over at Kismatic to get up a small POC running on OpenStack VMs with static routing. And that's the example I'm going to go in now. And I believe it's the path of least resistance. You don't have to worry about SDNs, overlays. You can run it up with static routing running neutron networks. So here's a network diagram. So bear with me while I go through this. So it's a 3-node cluster. We have a master and 2 nodes. Now, these are all deployed. We deploy straight from open source, and we pull down the repo straight onto these OpenStack VMs. So as you can see, these VMs, they're all connected by a single neutron network and have a single interface. Don't worry about photos. This is all in the open source repo, and it's all, you can get access to this. So each of the nodes has an ETH0 interface, and you deploy the cluster as you would in Vagrant. The only difference really being is that if you see over on the left, I assign a static route block to each node. So I actually statically route a block of address space for the containers on that node. And if you see the Docker 0 interfaces on the nodes, I actually bind that bridge interface to an address within that block. And it is going to route the traffic into those containers. So all I'm doing is providing a flat routed network to Kubernetes. Now, the only other piece of this is on the master node. So when you look at services in Kubernetes, which is basically a logical load balancing endpoint, which hits many containers on the back end, I've taken the block that sits on and routed into the master. Now, the secret sauce behind that is the kube proxy process, which if you look at that process, it actually just is really cute. It takes API calls in the network and maps them down into IP tables, DNATs. So as long as you're routing a static block that's externally addressable into that guy, you'll be able to hit all the service IPs. So this is one such example, and I'll give you access to the repo where I actually walk through and I have the scripts that I did to provision this. So great. I stood that up. It took 30 minutes. I was now able to hand that over to developers. But what I really wanted was to use more of the ecosystem that we had OpenStack running on, in particular the networking piece. So I went and looked at the networking piece, and we were running Contrail as our SDN for OpenStack. So I gave the guys over on the Contrail team at Juniper a call, and they said, fantastic, we have something that works. 10 minutes later, we had something up and running. So I'm going to give you access to what we have up and running. It's all open source as well, so you can get your hands wet if you want to play with an SDN. So really what I was trying to do with that was reuse the engineering effort we'd already put in to OpenStack to deliver networking into Kubernetes so that we didn't have to undertake another SDN and the operational overhead that comes with SDNs, as I'm sure you're all aware of. OK, so this is the next example that I'm going to hand over, which is a design using OpenStack VMs and Contrail to do the networking. So the design looks pretty similar to the existing design. I have a 3-node cluster. The only real difference here is I actually have 2 neutron networks. I have an ETH0 and an ETH1 interface on 2 discrete networks. And that was just to keep the control plane data and the container data off a management VLAN. It's for no other reason. You could have it off a single interface. The only difference between this design and the one I showed previously is you don't run kube proxy. And if you remember, kube proxy is actually the process that listens on networking API calls and writes them down into IP tables. So you can turn that off, and you replace it with the kube network manager, which is actually an application process provided by the Juniper Contrail team. And what that does is the same thing. It listens on the API calls, but instead of pushing them into IP tables, it pushes them into Contrail. So what you actually get is a network overlay running on a network overlay, so you get overlay inception. But you get all the great features we had with our SDN running OpenStack brought into the container world. And for that, it was secure multi-tenant access. So that was one of our requirements for VMs and why we chose Contrail. But suddenly we were able to bring secure multi-tenant access up inside the pods down to the VETH, the VETH interfaces, have them in network namespaces. So not only were we using namespaces for the containers, we were attaching them to network namespaces. So that was a great result. We actually had true multi-tenancy at a networking level in the Linux kernel. Okay, so what I wanted to highlight with this slide was I was so focused, and our team was so focused on delivering Kubernetes, we kind of lost sight of everything else that comes with the container journey. So we'd been working, you know, in our local development environments with containers. We didn't have a registry. We didn't have any of that stuff. So we slung up Kubernetes and we failed to see. So I just wanted to highlight some of the things we failed to see and we had to address after the fact. So it was interesting, you know, how do we provide developer access? And what I'm speaking to there is how do you give role-based access? So if your developers have access to a single Kubernetes endpoint and they're deploying their apps, how do you make sure that they don't stomp on other people's apps, delete other people's apps? All that kind of good stuff you come with role-based access. That was something we needed to address. Where do you put your containers? So we didn't have a registry. Suddenly we needed a home for containers. What does that look like? Where do we put that? And how do you monitor the cluster and the containers within it? So we already had a framework to monitor OpenStack, VMs, hypervisors, but we needed to bring that up into Kubernetes. The one interesting thing I will say, and for anybody who's worked with Kubernetes, it has secrets, service discovery, service accounts, health checking, all built into Kubernetes out of the box. So when you run up apps, you get that all for free. And you know, it's a great framework where you can actually monitor and get the real-time stats back from your apps out of the box with Kubernetes. So that was a great result for us. So as promised, here's a couple of repos. Feel free to come and talk to me afterwards. The intent with these repos was if you have 10 minutes and you have OpenStack, you should be able to run up Kubernetes. If that's not the case, come and see me because I want to get it to 10 minutes, and I think 10 minutes is too long. So the idea is I wanted to get the community starting to see how we could deliver containers on OpenStack, and this is just one such implementation using Kubernetes. So I have the Contrail and the static routing example. Feel free to let me know or get in contact with me if you have a better way. So great. So fast forward a month, we're at the end of August. I just wanted to share what we've learnt. So going into this, we thought, how are we going to spin up Kubernetes? Is it one big cluster? Does everybody have access to a single cluster? You know, how do we do it? One thing we learned was they're so lightweight, they actually cost nothing to spin up. You could give one per person, per developer, per project, per tenant in OpenStack. So really, they're almost throwaway in a sense. So you can spin them up as needed. Getting to Kubernetes makes your container journey easier. So we'd all been working with localized Docker, daemons, running up our apps, playing with them. But you kind of see the challenges of outgrowing that, persistent storage, networking, and how do you actually address those concerns. So when we moved people from, you know, straight Docker daemon running directly against it into Kubernetes, they could actually solve the networking and the persistence problems a lot more easily, leveraging the frameworks inside OpenStack. Simplifies complex application deployment. So if you've worked with Kubernetes, it's service-oriented. So you don't define a container. And this is one of the things that Craig said yesterday. You're actually defining an application. And I think that actually simplifies the process. So when you're defining it end-to-end and how it runs, so when you push something out, you have a multi-tiered app or even just a single-tier app. You can get it out into your environment, and the developers love it. They get service discovery, they get load balancers, and they get their containers out of the box with Kubernetes. So that was a great result. And finally, consistent developer experience. So we were able to actually provide an experience with Vagrant to the developers running Kubernetes where they could develop locally and then push it out to an environment. So they could develop against their local machine, produce what was the artifacts that were going to go into the production environment for Kubernetes, and actually hand them over and push them into production environments and know that they will run the same. So wish list, I threw this up. What I wanted to do was just throw out a couple of things that I've seen and a couple of things, that I would like to see from both sides of the community. One is, I'd love to be able to leverage more of the OpenStack APIs and to provide networking, storage, images. So, the power of having that platform is the APIs. I'd love to be able to reuse them. I have a couple of examples here. So I'd love to be able to talk to Cinder to provision storage. So Cinder could be my aggregation point for storage, and then I could just ask Cinder for storage, and it has the multiple backends, rather than plumbing that all into Kubernetes again. Make Lance a container registry. Maybe this is contentious. Make Swift a container registry. Can we have a container registry? There's plenty of places to store stuff in OpenStack. Why don't we just store the container images in OpenStack? So I kind of threw this out there. Maybe container registry as a service, something you can spin up and it hooks into one of those backends, whether it be Glance or Swift. And finally, the white paper that was published, having the time to go through that, I was really pleasantly surprised of where Magnum is at. And talking to Adrian Otto at Rackspace, the PTL of Magnum, I actually want to go back and iterate over Magnum now, because I think it's in a great spot for us to leverage things like role-based access using Keystone and actually going into the networking and using Neutron rather than calling out directly to these other APIs or using other SDNs. So, I hope that we can come together as a community and provide a more coherent experience cross-platform. So that was it. I have questions. What I wanted to just say is feel free to come and approach me. I'm happy to talk about any of this. Happy to give demos too. So if anybody has any questions, Yeah, we have a mic. Got a mic? Thank you.
Real easy question. What did you actually deploy?
What did we actually deploy? So we took our new multi-service, so we took our new microservices. So we took one that was actually set to be deployed at the end of the month, and we made that successful end-to-end. So from check-in to deployment, and that app was a real-time stats app. So it was ingesting data from a whole heap of places, aggregating it, throwing it into Kafka and serving that out. So that everything end-to-end, there was Zookeeper, Kafka, a whole bunch of our code running in containers inside Kubernetes. So we actually went for a really hard use case. We didn't go for the single stateless app. So, we were able to actually prove out a harder use case. Any other? What was that? Back to the QR code. Go back to the QR code? Sure. Any other questions? No? Well, I won't keep you. Thanks for listening.